Hello guys and welcome back to Deck Doctor. This week we are going to cover Senelian's Dream Control deck, a greedy, hard to play list which will challenge you as a player. So this isn't for the faint-hearted. This is going to take a lot of figuring out what your opponent's doing and how you're going to respond to that. And it does run a lot of legendary cards, so keep that in mind. So this deck is based around Aurora's Dream. You use cards to accelerate your Faeria like Storm Spawn and Windfall, and then you are able to combo stuff off like Yak Attack with Aurora Say and get tremendous amounts of value off that Dream. It's not the only way you can win. Gabrian Archons are very powerful, and you can use Aurora's creation to copy Archons and generate a lot of 6/6s on board with a lot of mobility with that charge too. So it has a lot of ways it can win, but the Dream win condition is obviously the more fun one and can be very effective if you can pull it off. Like I said, this deck is quite difficult to pilot. I have been playing it myself, and it's been hit or miss for me because sometimes I've made some mistakes. Other times I've played it quite well, and it will take some getting used to. At first this deck kind of seemed like it was a bit of a fun deck, but Senelian actually hit rank 1 God with this deck and held it for a day. So he has been using this deck at the highest level and getting results. So let's get into the deck, guys, and we'll start off by talking about the creatures. So to start things off, we have Lore Thief is going to be one of our main Faeria harvesters, but also gives us that card draw we need to get to those ramp cards like Windfall and Storm Spawn. Very valuable asset in this game, card draw, and especially with control decks. So yeah, pretty self-explanatory there. Collect Faeria, draw some cards. Aurora is one of the many legendaries in this deck. It's going to turn the attack of one of our creatures into a 6/6, and this has plenty of uses. You know, turn that Lore Thief from a 1/1 into a 6/6 and make it fight on board, but also has great combos with Yak Attack. You know, these Yaks have haste, so you'll be able to have a 6/6 with haste if you have enough Faeria. But also, you can copy it with Aurora's creation. A very powerful use of that card is to copy Aurora and be able to power up some of your smaller creatures. Next up is Gabrian Archon, a key card in any blue control deck, as there's a lot of high cost cards in this deck, and it's going to be able to trigger into a 6/6 for 4 Faeria with charge 2. Very powerful stat line and very powerful card in general, and also has fantastic synergies with the Aurora's creation because you can make multiple 6/6s that can zip around the board, collect Faeria, and fend off any aggression. And last but not least, it's not exactly a creature, but it does make creatures, and that is Yak Attack. Summon 3 2/2 Yaks with haste. These guys can collect Faeria for you, so you may even get a cost reduction based on where you play them. You want to be playing them around wells ideally if you can, and of course that interaction with Aurora is fantastic. And also, if they do survive after clearing a bunch of creatures, you can Aurora Say them and make them higher cost creatures for the following turn, or on the turn that they play, depending if you need a bit of board presence. So let's move on to some of your Faeria acceleration cards. So up first we have Baron Fulgar, which is a 6 cost 4/5. Last word, both of you and your opponent draw a card and it costs 0. Now, this may seem like a double-edged sword at first, but you have so many amazing cards you can hit with this. Windfall for one, Storm Spawn for another. But imagine if you got Aurora's Dream costing 0. That is some crazy stuff right now. And Aurora's Dream, which we'll cover a bit later on, allows you to draw until you have 9 cards in your hand, and it all costs 0 as well. So some amazing value can be found from the Baron. Storm Spawn up next, a 4/5 body. That has a last word that gives you 10 Faeria. This is a great card to fight on board with against colors like red and green because they don't have very effective ways to remove it. Red's not too bad actually, you know, they do have the damage based removal, but green is going to struggle a lot more, and you can get some value, maybe get some clears or some damage done onto their creatures. Against blue, you're not going to want to play this without Failed Experiment. Failed Experiment combo with this allows you to play this card and then it dies, and then you gain a free Faeria advantage. So keep that in mind. Same with kind of yellow as well. You don't want this to get Last Nightmare. You know, if you don't want to use it to fight on board against those two colors specifically. So most of the time you're going to be using this to with failed experiment, but against red and green you might want to use it to fight on board. Windfall is the last of the ramp cards, kind of the big daddy of ramp cards. We've seen this card a lot in blue. And keep in mind that Windfall and Stormspawn both activate your Archons, which are a key card in your early game, and of course in your late game as well when you combine it with Aurora's Creation to fighting on board. So these are going to help you gain Aurora's Dream quicker, and once you get Aurora's Dream down, usually you're going to be very far ahead because all those cards you draw are going to cost 0. So now you have all this Faeria. What type of creatures are you going to be summoning? We're going to cover some of the big daddies in this deck. So first up we have Aurorase, a 10 Faeria 6/6 that transforms all your creatures on board to 2 cost higher. So a Lore Thief becomes a 5 cost, an Archon becomes a 6 cost. You get the idea. To know kind of the range of creatures that you can get from Aurorase, it's going to take a little bit of research, kind of look in your collection and see what you can get. So sometimes you may need to Aurorase to make your smaller creatures bigger to be able to trade and stuff, but having a good idea of what you can get will help you. Lou did do a chart for it for Unbound Evolution when it existed, but it's a bit outdated, so that's definitely something we'd like to see in the future, a chart to cover Aurorase if this deck does get popular. Next up is Radiant. So this is one of your major combat cards, and this, oh man, this card has amazing potential in this deck. You draw a lot of cards anyway. You're a control deck. You're trying to build up to this dream, but not only that, Radiance can give you a comeback from healing. It can put an aggressive 10/10 on your opponent, but you can also Aurora's Creation it to get another Radiance to heal yourself again if you get in trouble. A very powerful card in this deck. So keep an eye on what you can do with this. Aurora's Creation is a fantastic combo. Last up is the king himself, Magnus. 10 Faeria 4/8 with charge free, and combat draw a card, it costs 0. And again, I discussed how Baron Folgar has amazing synergies to this deck. The king is exactly the same. And against red and green, this guy is not going to get transformed or hard removed like blue and yellow. It's going to have to be dealt with the old-fashioned way. So the more hits you get in with this card, the better it's going to be. So let's talk about some of the utility cards, which I've already talked about in the previous parts, such as Failed Experiment and Aurora's Creation. So up first, we'll talk about Failed Experiment, and I've already mentioned how this card is great with Stormspawn. It's going to be one of the main uses of Failed Experiment, but keep in mind as well, Lore Thief is a card you could use with this, Aurora in a tight spot. Lore Thief is good with this card if you play against red, because Lore Thieves are very easy for red to remove, especially green-red Warstorm as well. Another use of this card as well is if you have an Aurora's Dream ready to go off and you have a couple of these in your hand, it might be worth just using them so you get them out of your hand so you can draw more important stuff with your Aurora's Dream. So just keep that in mind when you're playing with Failed Experiment. And next up we have Frogify. So this is the premium transform effect for blue right now. Transform a creature into a 2/2, and it just helps you manage some of those big threats like Zealous Crusaders, for example, and it helps you gain the board back with Archons, because Archons are the way you're going to be keeping on board. So if you can transform something big and you can keep your Archon alive, it's probably worth it. Speaking of Archons, Aurora's Creation combined with Archon is very powerful. Just because you create very cheap 6/6s with charge 2, which have a lot of mobility on board. But you can also use this card with, say, Stormspawn if you want extra Faeria, Aurora herself, to get cheap power-ups. Radiance, which I talked about previously, is a very good combo with this card if you need some health. So you can get quite creative with Aurora's Creation. Try out a few combinations in the right situations and see what results you get. So before we wrap up all the cards, let's talk about Aurora's Dream. So Aurora's Dream brings this deck together. As you can see there, you draw until you have 9 cards in your hand and reduce the cost of all cards in hand to 0 for 24 Faeria. Very pricey card, but has an incredible effect. Against other control decks, you're going to be able to get this off quite a lot. Against more aggressive decks, you might not be able to, but this deck can still fight against those decks with all its Faeria acceleration, the Gabrian Archons, and the Yak attacks. So your primary goal is to get Aurora's Creation if it's reliable. You know, you don't stop taking control of the board to try and save up for Aurora's Creation if it's like 2 turns away, because that might give your opponent enough time to win the game. You have to kind of time it quite well, and that's kind of what makes this deck so complex, because a lot of the time you're going to be reacting to how your opponent plays, and sometimes that's going to allow you to play Aurora's Dream quite easily. Other times you're going to have to just ignore it and just fight on board and win the old-fashioned way. So it's going to take some practice to get used to this deck, but keep at it. It is very rewarding. So let's talk about the mulligans next. So the primary cards you want in your mulligan are Faeria collectors. Lore Thief is a great harvester, which I've said, but also draws you cards. Archon is the same, it has charge 2, so it can get around the Faeria wells very quickly. The Baron is also a great Faeria collector, but on the other hand, when his last words go off, you might be able to get that Windfall or that Aurora's Dream on the cheap, and you're going to be in a fantastic position. So these guys are all great keeps. The next 2 cards I'm going to talk about could also be good keeps as well. Windfall is also a fantastic keep in this deck, and if you keep Windfall and also have the option to keep Magnus, I would definitely recommend it, especially if you know your opponents are playing red or green, because it's going to be very hard for them to remove it without getting its combat ability off. So Windfall is definitely a keeper, in combination with a Gavra, and if you can keep Magnus as well, I definitely recommend it. So before we move on to land placement, let me talk about some of the changes you can make to this deck to help you against more aggressive decks. So as I was preparing this deck doctor, Senellian was still testing the deck, and one of the changes he made was adding Plague Bearers, because they have such good synergies with Failed Experiment and can lead to massive board wipes. And as you can see here, we have -1 Baron, -1 Yak attack, and -1 Aurora's Creation for +3 Plague Bearers. So if you find that your opponents are more aggressive, this may be a good switch for you to help fight those aggressive creatures with low health. Using those Failed Experiments, using Plague Bearers collectors can be quite awkward for your opponents if they're aggro players, because their creatures have such low health. And this was a recommendation by Senellian himself, so he has tried and tested this, and he said that this change helps against yellow quite a lot, so just keep that in mind. So let's talk about some of the land placements for this deck. Alright, we have a lot to cover with land placement. First off, I want to say straight away that you are responding to your opponent's land. So it's going to be you're going to need to play this deck quite a bit to get an idea of how you need to react to your opponent and how to do it correctly. The one thing I can say straight off the bat is a lake in the center is great, because this opens up what we call the Archon O, because your Archons have charge 2 and can move around the Faeria wells very effectively. So what I mean by this is, if you look at these lake placements here, now you don't need all of these, but these are great spots for lakes, because once you summon your Archon on one of them, they can double collect and they can move around the board in the O, and I'll show you an example of this O right now. So if you do have the land set up in this way, you are able to move your Archons freely, collect Faeria, and help defend on the board. Your primary goal is to collect Faeria so you can use the Aurora's Dream. So against more aggressive opponents, you're going to have to build a more control style from the side of your orb, whereas against a more mid-range deck, you can build on the opposite side of them. So if your opponent, for example, is going down this way, you're going to want to build your land around it so you can collect more Faeria and then defend later on to give you more chance to get your Windfalls off and your Storm Spawns. Now, I've played this deck quite a bit recently and I'm still figuring things out, so I'm just giving you the basics with this guide. It's going to take a bit of practice, but I can promise you all the different lines of plays you can make with this deck makes it so rewarding, and I can see this becoming a popular direction for blue to go, and especially with aggro not being as strong as it used to be, decks can be greedier. And the more greedier decks we get, this is probably going to be the king of them because it has that Aurora's Dream. So that wraps up this episode of Deck Doctor. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deck. It's quite complicated, but with some practice, I'm sure you guys will be able to handle it. If you do like this video, be sure to subscribe to this YouTube. I do not make videos on Play Fair anymore. All my video content will be featured on here. Be sure to check out the hub as well for the latest decks, guides, and articles from Faeria. So thank you very much again. Be sure to check out Deck Pilot if you want an idea of how this deck is played. That'll be released this week as well. And yeah, share this video with your friends. If you have any friends who are into Faeria and they like control decks, this might be the deck that you've been looking for. So until next time, guys, take care. Have a great day.